The landscape of human emotion is often divided by a silent, invisible boundary, one shaped by centuries of cultural expectations and psychological conditioning. When we examine the divergent ways in which genders experience and manifest psychological distress, we uncover a profound disparity in social reception. Traditionally, the female experience of suffering has been characterized by externalization. Within the clinical framework, women are often more predisposed to vocalize their internal states, seeking social support as a primary coping mechanism. This suffering out loud serves a dual purpose. It acts as an emotional release for the individual and a signal to the community that intervention or empathy is required. Because society has historically permitted and even encouraged this expressive form of vulnerability in women, the social scaffolding exists to catch them when they fall. There are established vocabularies for female grief, anxiety, and sadness, which allows for a more streamlined transition from the recognition of pain to the procurement of help. In stark contrast, the male experience is frequently defined by a paradigm of internalization. Men are often conditioned to view their suffering as a private burden, one that must be managed in isolation to maintain a veneer of competence and stability. This suffering in silence is not merely a personal choice, but a systemic adaptation to a social environment that often penalizes male vulnerability. From a clinical perspective, this leads to a phenomenon where male distress remains subclinical or invisible until it reaches a point of crisis. While a woman might seek therapy or peer support at the onset of moderate depressive symptoms, a man may wait until those symptoms manifest as physical ailments, substance abuse, or total social withdrawal. This silence is not the absence of pain. Rather, it is the presence of a protective shell that obscures the underlying turbulence from the view of others, leading to a pervasive misunderstanding of the male emotional state. To address this growing gap in emotional literacy and support, we are introducing a dedicated resource designed to bridge the chasm between internal suffering and external support. The Foundation for Integrative Masculinity is a new, subscription based mental health community specifically tailored to the unique psychological needs of men. This platform is built on the understanding that men require a different kind of container for their emotional experiences, one that emphasizes clinical accuracy, peer led resilience, and practical tools for emotional regulation. Members gain access to an extensive library of evidence based modules that deconstruct the Stoic archetype, replacing it with a model of functional vulnerability. This includes weekly live sessions led by clinical psychologists who specialize in male centric trauma and communication. By joining this community, men can move beyond the isolation of silent suffering into a space where their experiences are validated by science and shared by others who have faced similar internal battles. It provides the vocabulary that many men were never given the chance to learn, facilitating a transition from repression to authentic expression. The roots of this emotional silence are often found in the earliest stages of developmental psychology. In early childhood, the process of gender socialization begins to prune the emotional range of young boys. While young girls are frequently encouraged to label their feelings and seek comfort, boys often receive subtle or overt cues that their emotional displays are inappropriate or weak. This early childhood suppression creates a foundational difficulty in communicating feelings later in life. When a child is told to man up or stop crying, the brain's neurocircuitry begins to prioritize suppression over processing. Over time, this results in a condition known as normative male alexithymia, a subclinical inability to identify and describe emotions. For many men, the internal sensation of distress is felt physically, as tension in the chest or a dull ache in the head, but they lack the cognitive bridge to label that sensation as loneliness or insecurity. Because they cannot name the feeling, they cannot communicate it to others, leading to a cycle of frustration and further withdrawal. This inability to communicate is compounded by the incorrect assumptions and reactionary judgments that society often projects onto men. When a man is struggling, his withdrawal is rarely interpreted as a cry for help. Instead, it is often viewed through a lens of apathy, coldness, or even aggression. If a man becomes distant in a relationship, The assumption is frequently that he is losing interest or being intentionally withholding, rather than that he is drowning in an internal crisis he cannot articulate. These reactionary judgments create a feedback loop where the man feels misunderstood and judged for the very symptoms of his distress. Clinical observation suggests that men are often held to a competency requirement that does not allow for the messiness of psychological breakdown. When they fail to meet this standard, the social response is often one of irritation or condemnation rather than curiosity or empathy. This mismatch between the man's internal reality and the public's perception of him further reinforces the necessity of the silent mask. When men do find themselves as targets of victimization, whether through domestic abuse, workplace harassment, or social bullying, the psychological fallout is exacerbated by a deep seated tendency towards self blame. Because the cultural narrative positions men as the protectors and providers, being a victim creates a profound sense of cognitive dissonance. A man who has been victimized often feels he has failed a fundamental test of his masculinity. He asks himself why he wasn't strong enough to prevent the situation or why he allowed himself to be vulnerable. This internalized shame acts as a barrier to reporting or seeking justice. In a clinical setting, male victims of trauma often present with survivor guilt that is deeply tied to their identity as men. They may minimize their own trauma, convincing themselves that it wasn't that bad or that they should have handled it better. Society often mirrors this sentiment, struggling to recognize male victimhood because it conflicts with the traditional image of male agency. This lack of recognition leaves many men to process severe trauma entirely on their own, leading to long term psychological scarring. Perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of the male emotional experience is the role of anger. In many cases, anger is the only socially permissible high arousal emotion for men. While sadness, fear, or shame are often coded as feminine or weak, anger is seen as an expression of strength or dominance, however misguided. Consequently, men frequently utilize anger as a secondary emotion, a protective layer that covers more vulnerable primary emotions. When a man feels hurt, his brain may instinctively convert that hurt into anger because anger feels safer and more active than the passivity of grief. However, society reacts to this anger with fear or counteraggression, completely missing the underlying pain that triggered it. This creates a tragic irony. The man expresses his pain through the only channel he feels is available to him, but that channel is the very thing that alienates him from the support he needs. To truly understand male anger, one must look beneath the surface of the outburst. Clinically, this is often referred to as the anger iceberg. While the visible tip is the shouting, the irritability, or the frustration, the vast submerged portion is composed of feelings like inadequacy, exhaustion, and profound sadness. Because society only sees the tip, it labels the man as angry or toxic, failing to realize that his behavior is actually a distorted form of weeping. This misunderstanding has severe social consequences, as it leads to the criminalization or pathologization of men who are actually in need of emotional regulation and trauma processing. By reframing anger as a misunderstood emotional expression, we can begin to address the root causes of male distress, rather than just reacting to its symptoms. The path forward requires a systematic dismantling of these outdated emotional paradigms. It involves training educators, parents, and partners to look for the subtle signs of male suffering that differ from the traditional female markers. It means recognizing that a man's silence is often a heavy burden rather than a sign of stability. It requires acknowledging the agency gap, the reality that men are often expected to be bulletproof, leaving them with no place to go when they are wounded. Through resources like the Foundation for Integrative Masculinity, the goal is to create a new cultural script where a man's strength is measured by his ability to navigate his internal world with the same precision and courage he applies to the external world. By shifting our perspective from judgment to inquiry, we can begin to uncover the rich, complex, and often painful emotional lives that men lead behind closed doors. We must move toward a clinical and social environment where the stoic silence is no longer the default, and where anger is recognized as the complex signal that it truly is. Only through this deep, empathetic understanding can we hope to reduce the rates of male suicide, substance abuse, and social isolation. The transformation of male mental health is not just a benefit for men themselves, it is a vital step toward a more compassionate and functional society for everyone. Understanding the nuances of how men suffer, how they were taught to hide that suffering, and how they ultimately express it is the first step in breaking the cycle of misunderstanding that has persisted for far too long. This is the work of the modern era to bring the silent suffering into the light and to offer a hand to those who have been taught that asking for one is a sign of defeat. In reality, the courage to be seen in one's totality is the highest form of strength a man can achieve.